Chaps, welcome back to SJMMA, and happy Monday, by the way. Everyone loves a Monday. Today, we are going to be talking about UFC fights that cause massive shifts in the careers of the athletes. Some of these in this video will affect both fighters, and some will have a massive impact on one of them. We're going to start with the one that you can see on your screen, Jorge Masvidal against Darren Till. This one headlined the last UFC London card before the COVID pandemic. Obviously, the main event, as we've just said, was Jorge Masvidal against Darren Till at the O2 Arena. Darren Till had just lost his rushed welterweight title fight against Tyron Woodley. He got beat up pretty badly, and Jorge Masvidal had about 15 to 18 months off, I believe, after two split decision losses against Wonderboy and Damian Maia. Now, for those of you who don't know, in that time, Masvidal went on kind of a, if you're from the UK, you'd know it as kind of like an I'm a Celebrity kind of show. I believe it was in Cuba, I think. And he literally said, there's a great scene from that show where he said, I need to stop letting my fights go the distance. I need to start baptising people. And he started with Mr. Till in London. Obviously, from Masvidal's end, what went on to happen in the rest of that year is why this fight was so massive. Straight afterwards, he had the 3 peas in the soda, which made him go viral. Then he went on to the flying knee of Ben Askren. Then he won the BMF title against Nate Diaz. None of those other things would have happened if it wasn't for that brilliant finish of Mr. Till in London. Now, even at that point in his career, I think Masvidal was sort of 33, 34, somewhere around there. He'd been a veteran of MMA. He first kind of got any kind of fame competing in the Kimbo Slice backyard brawls in Miami. He was in Strikeforce, he was in Bellator, he fought for the Strikeforce belt, lost it against Gilbert Melendez, I believe it was. And in the UFC, he was kind of up and down. A lot of the decisions he was losing were close and controversial, especially one, I remember him losing to Ally Quinta. That was a bad scorecard. Either way, the surprise nature of it made it even more impressive on Gamebred's side. From Till's perspective, it was his last fight at welterweight. He'll never make that weight again. Look at the size of him now, the fat bastard. Either way, he went up to middleweight. He won his debut against Kelvin Gastelum on the Masvidal against Diaz BMF card, and he never won another UFC fight again. As much as losing against Tyron Woodley was a bad performance, I think this was the one that really broke down Darren Till and started to unravel him mentally, to be honest. So they were both impacted by this one. We shall move on to UFC 249's main event of Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje. A sad one, but if you talk about impacting the careers of fighters, I don't think many get more impactful than this one. Unfortunately, most of the impact went on Tony Ferguson, and it was all negative, both in the cage and what's followed. Of course, UFC 249 was supposed to be Khabib Tony, but pandemic, Khabib in Russia. Tony Ferguson made way for the original date of UFC 249 about 3 weeks before he fought Justin Gaethje, which a lot of people say was a mistake. I believe it was a mistake as well, because Tony was getting on in age. He was trying to do Tony things and just be a complete madman and prove he was ready, even though the world was interrupted, but it probably cost him in the cage. I don't really want to spend too much time speaking about what's happened to El Kukui since this day, but if you track it back, this was the fight that ended a 12-fight win streak, and he's not won since, as we know. Sadly so. So, yeah. From being the high of the high, one of the 2 best lightweights on the planet, to, you know, where he is now. Fucking hell. And even Gaethje as well. This was around about the period of time, and this was definitely the fighter for me as a fan, that I looked at Gaethje and thought, you're evolving here, pal. Because before the kind of Tony Ferguson fight, he was a complete nutcase. He would just swing for the hills. That's why he lost a couple in his early time in the UFC. He was all gas, no brakes. Especially in that Tony fight, we started to see a more calculated and measured version of Justin Gaethje, which I think worked wonders in that fight and allowed him to effectively just systematically beat Tony up for what was it, 22 minutes? We will stay in the lightweight division with UFC 262's headliner of Charles Oliveira versus Michael Chandler, the first one, back in 2021. Or actually, no, it was 2020, wasn't it? Was it 2021? I don't know, it's all COVID. I can't really tell the difference, to be fair. All of the impact and the change in the career for me was all about Oliveira in this one. With Michael Chandler, if you'd watched any of him in Bellator and if you've watched him since, you kind of know what he's all about. He's a battering ram. He'll take a whack. He'll come forward. He's exciting. Oliveira had that quitter label for so many years. He'd already started to break the mould after a really, really good run when he returned up to lightweight. He obviously lost to Paul Felder a few years ago. I think it was 2018. He went on a great run. Most recently, before 262, he beat I think it was Kevin Lee first and then Tony Ferguson at UFC 256 the December before he fought Michael Chandler, I believe. But I have absolutely no doubt, after the first round that Michael Chandler had, the Charles Oliveira of old would not have made it through that round. He had an ability to survive now. He had an ability to dig deep. He had an ability to find a way to win. That's what all great champions do, and he became champion that night, as we know. Because that was a bad first round. I don't agree with one of the judges, 10-8 Chandler. That was a bit far for me, but he was hurt bad. Really, really bad. And he came back and he chinned him in the second. That is not what Oliveira would have done in 2017, something like that. So yeah, that was the fight for me that really showed that Oliveira was the real deal. And since then, he's become one of the most popular guys in the entire promotion. So yeah, massive fight for the career of Oliveira. I don't think you can possibly get more career shifting than Nate Diaz's win over Michael Johnson in 2015. Now, again, for Michael Johnson, not a lot really changed. If you've ever watched MJ fight, he's basically been the same kind of guy for the last 15 years. For Diaz, it was huge. At the time, there was still very much a surviving narrative of the fact that Nate Diaz was literally just the younger brother of Nick. Now, if you don't know the lore, let's say, of Nick Diaz, then go back and watch his fights. He had a great fight in Pride with Takanori Gomi. He knocked out a very young Robbie Lawler in the UFC. Obviously had a great run as the welterweight champion in Strikeforce. Had a wonderful fight with UK's own Mr. Paul Daly. Wonderful fight. If you've not seen that fight, it only lasted for a round, but it was gorgeous, right? And then he obviously came back into the UFC and fought the likes of BJ Penn and Carlos Condit. And of course, he had a welterweight title fight against George St. Pierre, which he lost, but, you know, his star power was through the roof. And Nate had won a season of The Ultimate Fighter. The hardcores knew of him and were massive fans of him, but in terms of breaking into the mainstream like his older brother did, he hadn't done it to that point. He was very up and down. He's always kind of been up and down, Nate, regardless of how much fame he's got. I remember a fight with RDA, which was, yeah, there was something wrong with Nate that night. I believe he actually did say he was either injured or ill or something. He looked awful. But you fast forward to this fight, which I think this Michael Johnson performance was one of his best anyway. Wonderful boxing, that quintessential classic Diaz kind of swagger / arrogance, just kind of strolling around the octagon pointing at people. That's just basically what those boys do. He then got on the microphone and called out Conor, which a few people had done around about that point. He was the cash cow, it made sense. And then we get to UFC 196, right? Not only did he get the fight, but he also won it. Nate Diaz would not have got that fight if he did not call for it. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind at all. They would have found a relatively decent high-ranked lightweight to fight Conor for an interim belt while RDA was injured, which, who knows? It may have been Eddie Alvarez a year early. It may have even been Khabib or Tony. We'll never know how that would have played out if it wasn't Diaz, but it was. Not only he called for the fight, he bloody won it as well, as we know, in wonderful fashion. Very Nate Diaz. Loads of pressure on the feet. Make them believe they can wrestle, or to be safe, choke them out. Classic Diaz. It took him to a level he'd never been at before, and he's now a megastar. Almost all down to that fight and that call-out, so has to be on the list. We're going to stay with the art of the call-out, and we're going to move on to Colby Covington's win over Damian Maia in Brazil in 2017. Now, it was nothing particularly out of the ordinary in terms of performance from Colby. Great weaponisation of cardio, great offensive wrestling, chain wrestling as we know. Really nullified Damian Maia. It was a good performance, really was. But it was afterwards that really changed his career. At that point in time, he was just a bloke. There was nothing particularly interesting about Covington as a fighter. His style wasn't particularly fan-friendly, as we know. And he didn't really have a lot going for him until he got on the microphone and said, and I'm sure you all know, Brazil, you're a dump, or you filthy animals suck. And everything changed. Everything changed. He became the heel, which we know is fake. It's a facade, he puts it on, but he's changed his life financially because of it, so fair play to him. As a lot of you will know, the bad guy himself, Mr. Chael Sonnen, was a big part of the early career of Mr. Colby Covington. Now, there was obviously some kind of words exchange there from Chael. It hasn't really been confirmed from either side. It's been hinted at, but however he got there, whoever his inspiration was, why ever he did it, it worked. I remember Dana White very recently in an interview said, you don't want to be the guy who walks into an arena and nothing happens. If you're there to cheer him or boo him, doesn't matter to Colby Covington. He changed his life with that one phrase. So, talk about a career shift, right? And we will finish off with another quite sad one. UFC 260's main event of Francis Ngannou in a rematch with Stipe Miocic. Now, if you remember their first fight at UFC 220, it was basically just a more patient, composed Stipe Miocic using his offensive grappling to take down the wild and erratic Ngannou. In between the first and second fights of these two, the only person that Stipe Miocic fought was Daniel Cormier, and Ngannou was destroying guys. He knocked out Cain Velasquez, Junior Dos Santos, Curtis Blades for a second time, so many top guys. But he was still kind of erratic. If you recall, not long before UFC 260, he had a fight with Jairzinho Rozenstruik on the Ferguson Gaethje card 249, and he just, one of the most wild things I've ever seen. He's just literally winging from the first bell. No technique, no structure to anything, just throwing his fist in the general direction of his opponent. Then you get to UFC 260, and what we saw was a composed, intelligent, technically sound Francis Ngannou. Shrugged off an early takedown from Stipe in the first round, hurt him relatively badly in the first, but then you get to the second round. He hurt Stipe bad. He didn't jump all the way in. He did kind of overlean a little bit, and Stipe cracked him back. And Stipe thought Ngannou was hurt, and he came rushing in, a little bit like you'd expect from Francis. And Francis just stepped back, bing, bing, down, out. It's a similar kind of thing to what I was saying earlier about Justin Gaethje, the idea of having that raw aggression. I mean, the power advantage of Ngannou over Gaethje is crazy, so it's slightly different, but the idea of rounding yourself out and becoming more measured on top of your natural gifts, that fight proved that Francis has that in his locker, and he'd matured as a mixed martial artist so much since their first fight. Right, okay lads, you're probably wondering why any of that is sad. Well, obviously from Stipe's point of view, he got chinned badly, didn't fight for 4 years, recently came back and got smoked by John Jones and retired. Not exactly brilliant. And for Ngannou, right as we were beginning to see him become a mixed martial artist, I mean, he went off the back of the Miocic fight and took down Cyril Gane and used his grappling to get a decision victory over 5 rounds. Who'd have thought Ngannou would ever do that? But around about the time we were just seeing him really come into his own in MMA, that was when the problems with the UFC really started to arise, and we never saw him really at the elite of his game against the elites in the UFC. And because of the relationship with Dana and Francis being really strained, and Francis not getting any younger, he'll probably never be back in the UFC. One of the most concrete stories of a one-dimensional fighter rounding out his game. We were robbed to see if he could actually dominate at heavyweight, because he might well have done. He also might well not have done. He may have ended up fighting John Jones and got subbed in a minute like Cyril Gane did. Who knows? He could wobble Aspinall and then get chinned himself. We don't know how those fights are going to play out now, and unless the money is astronomical, we never will. So, yeah, the real sad thing about this career shift is we never really got to see where or how far Francis would have taken that in the UFC. We never got to see that, which is a real shame. So there we go, chaps. That is my video on some UFC fights that caused massive shifts in the careers of fighters. Some good, some bad, some a bit of both. You know what I mean? I really enjoyed making this one. It was great to go back and sort of evaluate fights and fighters. If you want to see a part 2, there's loads more I could talk about. This is just scratching the surface. I'll talk to you very soon. Stay tuned for the next video and take care.